Welcome, students. I am so glad you're joining us today for this explainer on what is, quite frankly, one of the absolutely most critical and definitely most frequently tested rules in all of ICD-10-CM coding. I'm talking about Excludes notes. Today, we're going to totally master exactly what happens when two conditions collide in your coding manual. We'll uncover the absolute baseline rule that tells you when you need to just stop in your tracks, and honestly, more importantly, we're going to reveal a massive exception that trips up even the most experienced coders out there.
Here is our quick roadmap for today. We'll start with number 1, the Excludes definition. Then move to 2, the critical exception. After that is 3, when to query, 4, common coding pitfalls, 5, the MJ-GEM, and finally 6, the summary and the AMCI way.
All right, let's jump right into section 1, the Excludes definition.
Okay, so let's dive into this by establishing our absolute baseline rule. An Excludes note is what we call a pure excludes note. In the medical coding world, it literally translates to not coded here. Think of this thing as a giant flashing red stop sign right there in your tabular list. When you see an Excludes note, it means the excluded code should basically never be used alongside the code situated right above it. It's an either-or situation. You have to make a choice. Now you might be wondering, why is this rule so strict? Well, the pure logic behind this is actually absolutely fascinating. Why does ICD-10-CM put this giant stop sign in place? It's really simple. These two conditions physically cannot coexist in the patient at the exact same time. The rules of human anatomy and physiology, or even just the definitions of the diseases themselves, dictate that a patient literally just cannot have both of these specific iterations of a condition simultaneously.
To put that into perspective, think about a congenital condition, something a patient is born with. Now compare that to the acquired form of that exact same condition, something that develops way later in life. A patient cannot have a purely congenital and a purely acquired form of the exact same condition at the same time, right? They are mutually exclusive. That right there is your default scenario for an Excludes note. They simply cannot be reported together.
Moving on to section 2, the critical exception. But let's be real for a second. Anyone who's actually reviewed medical records knows that patient care is rarely ever that black and white. So here is the massive unless to our Excludes rule. The guidelines explicitly state, if the two conditions are completely unrelated, both codes may be reported together. Wow, right? This is where you really have to put on your medical detective hat. You aren't just matching numbers in a book anymore, you are actively analyzing the clinical documentation to see if these two diagnoses have absolutely anything to do with one another. Let's actually look at an example to make this concrete. Take code F45.8, which is for other somatoform disorders. Right under it, there's an Excludes note for G47.63, which is sleep-related teeth grinding. Now, if the provider is just using different terms to document the exact same condition, like they're both just describing teeth grinding, you have to pick just one code. That's your standard Excludes rule in action. But what if the patient has psychogenic dysmenorrhea, coded to F45.8, and they just so happen to also have sleep-related teeth grinding, coded to G47.63? Well, those are completely unrelated conditions. One is a menstrual disorder, the other is a sleep disorder. Because they are completely separate, both codes are perfectly valid to report together on the exact same claim. Now, that works beautifully when the documentation is crystal clear. But what happens when the clue is an Excludes note, yet the mystery of how they're related remains totally unsolved in the medical record? What if you're staring at the chart and you honestly, truly just don't know if the conditions are related?
That brings us to section 3, when to query.
So, here is your standard, absolute, fail-safe protocol for handling ambiguous medical documentation. Let's walk through the workflow together. Step 1. You identify the Excludes conflict in your tabular list. Step 2. You review the documentation to determine if the conditions are related or if they're completely separate. And Step 3. If you are in any doubt at all, you query the provider. I really cannot emphasize this enough. Guessing is never, ever an option in medical coding. If the relationship is unclear, querying the provider is the required action to ensure your coding is accurate and compliant. All right, let's head into section 4, common coding pitfalls. Now that we know the right way to handle Excludes we got to pivot and talk about the wrong way. You absolutely must avoid these critical errors, especially if you want to protect yourself from failing exams and triggering some really painful audits. First, do not automatically code both conditions without checking that Excludes note.
Next, do not assume Excludes 1 always allows both codes just because you learned about the exception. Never ignore the fundamental not coded here rule. Be super careful not to miss the exception when conditions actually are unrelated. And finally, do not fail to query when things are vague. I'm telling you, these exact errors are what lead directly to immediate claim denials, loss of reimbursement, and massive, massive compliance nightmares.
Okay, Section 5, the MJ gem. To make absolutely sure you never fall into those traps we just talked about, it's time to introduce the MJ gem. This is the memorable anchor concept that's going to lock this entire guideline into your brain forever. The crucial point is this: Excludes 1 equals one or the other, not both. Let that sink in for a second. By default, this is your absolute golden rule of Excludes 1. If you remember literally nothing else today, remember that they generally cannot be coded together.
But to fully apply it in the real world, we need to expand that MJ gem just a little bit. Same condition? Pick one. Different conditions? Check the exception. I really want you to build a mental reflex here, where you are constantly asking yourself, are these conditions related? If they're the same condition or closely related forms of it, you pick one. If they're completely different, unrelated conditions happening in the exact same patient, you check that exception and you code both.
And finally, Section 6, Summary in the AMCI way. Let's pull all of these pieces together and bring it home. Here are your core takeaways. Number 1, Excludes 1 fundamentally means not coded here. Number 2, it prevents related codes from coexisting on your claim because the conditions physically cannot coexist. Number 3, the massive exception is that if the conditions are completely unrelated, you can and absolutely should code both. And number 4, if you are ever unsure, query the provider. Honestly, your accuracy entirely depends on successfully identifying whether those conditions are related or separate.
So, the next time you're tackling a chart, I want to leave you with this final, empowering thought. Whenever you see that Excludes 1 note, just pause and ask yourself, are these conditions the same or are they completely separate? Letting the answer to that question guide you ensures you are coding accurately and confidently the AMCI way. But remember, we only talked about Excludes 1 today. What happens when your manual throws an Excludes 2 note at you? Well, we're going to have to save that mystery for our next explainer. Thanks for joining me.